welcome today. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Connor Judge. I'm a manager of cities with the Cities Deepening Community Team, and it is an absolute pleasure for me to be introducing today's webinar, Making Community Essential, 7 Impacts for Communities and the Policy Shifts to Get There. I'm very interested for today's conversation, and I'm sure you are as well. So let's start things off. First, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So we begin this webinar by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real within our communities. As part of our commitment to Canada's truth and reconciliation process, we recognize the importance of land recognitions as one small way of honoring and demonstrating respect for the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples. I personally am joining from Toronto, which is derived from the Mohawk expression of trees submerged in water. This land is colonially known as Toronto. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudestosanees, and the Wendat peoples. By acknowledging these lands and their original stewards, I'm trying to position myself, a white settler, within the social, historical, and political context embedded within the lands known as Canada, as well as commemorating Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land. So please, within the chat box, share what lands you're joining from. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'm now going to pass it over to my colleague, Justin. So Justin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Connor. As Connor mentioned, my name is Justin Williams, and I'm Tamarack's Manager of Policy and Development. I want to respectively acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional territory of Etowah, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. Kitchener-Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land that was promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. In my role at Tamarack, I strive to embed reconciliation and anti-racism into Tamarack's policy activities, recognizing the role that public policy has played in establishing and reinforcing colonial structures that have committed violence. So just want to make sure I say that. And in my role as the Manager of Policy and Development, I have the pleasure of supporting our outcomes-focused networks like Deepening Community to consider the policy levers that can make the work happening in communities easier and more effective. In Deepening Community, we are building a vibrant network of communities that are committed to strengthening neighborhoods and fostering positive community change through resident-led action. Over the last 4 years, we've built a network of more than 40 communities actively engaged in this work, with the learning network of more than 9,000 individuals building a movement for making community essential. And we're really excited by that growth because it shows that there's a really important movement of individuals that recognize that that our social connection is really important, and we want to deepen that work. So we know that community is essential for addressing the complex challenges we face today. From working with our members, we know that when community is made a priority, we see impacts in the sense of belonging for individuals, equity and inclusion within communities, the level of civic engagement, enabling care and acting together. We can strengthen resilience, including for both individuals and the natural environment around them. We have better sense of community safety, community health and wellness, and we have empowered local economies. So we're really dedicated to strengthening this work. And we're starting to examine and explore the ways that institutions and governments can empower their communities to develop and implement strategies to increase those 7 areas of impact. And that's why we're really excited about this webinar today and the work that Mahammad's been doing with us. So I'm joined today by Samuel Center for Social Connectedness Fellow, Mahammad Raza. Mahammad is in their final year at the University of Toronto, and they're majoring in economics and public policy. We were fortunate to have him bring his passion for rooting policy change discussions in equity, fairness, and sustainability to examining the policy work that we're doing at Tamarack to make community essential and supporting the impacts for deepening community through the lens of asset-based community development. I'm going to turn it over to Mahammad in a second, but before we get into that, I really want to make sure that I thank the Samuel Center for allowing Tamarack to participate in their fellowship program. The Samuel Center for Social Connectedness selects students and recent graduates to carry out innovative research and create action to build community. And Tamarack over the summer months has been really happy to be part of this process with them and for the chance to work with Mahammad. So I'm really excited about today's webinar and learning more about what Mahammad has learned over the last little bit. Before I turn to Mohammed, which I'm going to do in a second, I'll just say Mohammed's going to give a brief presentation of the research, and then we have some set questions, but we're also looking for questions for all of you who are watching us. So please use the Q&A section at the bottom to ask your questions as we move through today. But from here, I will turn it over to Mohammed. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mohammad. I'm very excited to be here. This summer, I worked with the Tamarack Institute and the Samuel Center for Social Connectedness on a very exciting project, which was asset-based community development, its impacts, and how it is shaping in new communities, and especially for newcomers in Canada. So while this research was very exciting, I was able to identify a lot of issues, problems, gaps that exist, and also find answers to some of them. So I'm going to be sharing my research with you. So can we go to the next slide, please? So firstly, I'm very grateful that you can all join us today. And while we talk about making community essential, it's very important to just recognize that the basis of all community development, and specifically asset-based community development, is definitely equity and inclusion and diversity. And that is something that I've tried to highlight throughout my research, which I'm going to be showing you now. So the topic or the issue of my research comes from a reality that we're all living in, and that is the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's just the way that we are now looking at the importance of community. So after almost over 2 years of social isolation and living in constant disconnect from community members, from people we love, from people that we want to be with, it's been very difficult on a lot of people's mental health, and as a result, even their physical health. And what has come out of this, which I believe is a positive impact, has definitely been how we now view community. And over the course of my research, talking to a lot of community leaders, community members, students on campuses, what I've realized is that everyone is now looking to form community, is now looking to connect with other people in their community, which they were not really looking to do before the COVID-19 pandemic. So while the pandemic has been horrible, I do believe that the community development aspect of it is something that we can take forward as a positive takeaway. Now, working with the Tamarack Institute, I decided to explore their preferred model of community development, which is asset-based community development. I'm sure a lot of community members are already acquainted with what asset-based community development is. I'm going to be using the acronym ABCD as I move on. But just a little bit about ABCD, I have looked at multiple models of community development over the course of my research. And what I found to be different about asset-based community development specifically was the fact that it comes from a place of abundance, was the fact that it comes from a place that we already have everything that we need in terms of resources, in terms of assets, in terms of people. While other models of community development look at needs and look at deficiencies, asset-based community development celebrates abundance and celebrates what is already present there. While that is something that is established, it's very important to look at the fact that we need to now move asset-based community development towards groups that have suffered the most due to social isolation and due to a lack of community, where a lack of community is directly impacting their physical and mental health, and as a result, their self-actualization. And for this reason, the group that I identified was the immigrants, or I would say newcomers to Canada. Apart from that, marginalized communities, racialized communities, sexual minorities, these are all communities that I personally have found through my research and interviews to be communities that definitely need a stronger and more integrated approach for community development and for them to have a sense of community. Just a note about my research and even about this conversation that we're about to have. Throughout my report, I've tried to use an approach of using democratized language. And this is just in my efforts to make sure that academia is not a border that people cannot cross. I have tried to make sure that this report and everything that I've researched with the Tamarack Institute and the Samuel Center over the summer is not something that is only read by academics. And then, there are a lot of hurdles to get to and understand it. I have used simple language. I have used democratized language, which is easily accessible and also relatable to a lot of folks. So that's just a note about the research that I've done. Working with the Tamarack Institute, the one thing that I'm very glad that I learned about was definitely the 7 areas of impact. This is a lens by which we look at community development. And I'm very glad that I was able to look at community development through this lens, because all 7 areas of impact that I researched, I got different responses from our community members and leaders on what they believe can be done in each area of impact, which personally I believe has made asset-based community development a very holistic approach to community development for me. Starting with a sense of belonging, then moving on to how we can make this approach more equitable and inclusive, and then making sure that we have civic engagement happening within our communities, and how we can move forward after the wake of a pandemic in terms of strengthening resilience. And then very interesting ones which people normally overlook, such as community safety, and getting a very new outlook on what community safety looks like, and then community health and wellness, and how we can empower our local economies. So while I was working through my project and working through my paper, I had a couple of key questions that arose for me very early on. And one of them was definitely, who does not have a seat at the table? And I would like to thank my partner at the Tamarack Institute, Justin, for also making sure that this is a question that we ask ourselves again and again throughout the process. And I feel like we always need to ask this question whenever we are trying to talk about community development or we're trying to talk about inclusion. It's very easy to celebrate who is at the table, but it's just as easy to then also think about who's not there, right? Because if we don't have a diverse group of people representing our model, then I don't think that we are going to succeed in making it permeate into all the communities that we wanted to permeate into. The second question that I had about ABCD right off the bat was definitely just how can we increase people's participation? So while it's a great model and we've seen some amazing work happen across neighborhoods and communities, I do believe that there is still leeway for increasing participation, and specifically youth participation, which I'll be talking about. And then the third one, which ties into who does not have a seat at the table, is just how can we make ABCD more inclusive? So this is just to say, if someone is not present in our conversation, why are they not present there? And how can we make sure that firstly, they want to join this conversation and we can make this conversation palatable for them or exciting for them. Then moving on, I believe it's very important to try to figure out what we can do to make sure that we gain traction and that the areas of impact lead to results. So when we look at it through a lens of the areas of impact, the 7 areas of impact, it's very important to look at how we can garner results from them and how we can garner traction. And the last thing, which was the focal point of my research, was how can these areas of impact, or the lens of the areas of impact, then translate into policy recommendations, which can be provided to municipal governments, local governments, provincial and federal governments as well. Just a little bit about my findings, and we'll discuss that more as we go towards the questions. I have found out that there is an absolute lack of immigrant perspective in the discourse surrounding ABCD. And the reason that this is very upsetting is because throughout my research, I also was able to garner the fact that many communities, especially immigrant communities and newcomers to Canada, are practicing asset-based community development without even knowing that they are practicing this, right? So when I interviewed them, I told them what if they are practicing asset-based. I asked them if they're practicing asset-based community development, and a lot of them had the same answer, that no, they don't know what this is and they've never heard of this before. But when I described it to them in detail and showed them the calls to action and was able to show to them the kind of work that is in line with asset-based community development, a majority of them were able to relate with the work and were able to say that in that case, they have in fact been practicing asset-based community development their entire life. So I feel like the one thing that we definitely need to focus on is making sure that we break the barriers to people understanding what asset-based community development is. That can be done through a lot of things, such as permeating it within different languages, which is translating our work. Or just making sure that we democratize the knowledge that we already have to communities that have already been practicing their work, to celebrate their work, and to make sure that we bring different people to the forefront. Another thing that I have found through my research has definitely been that the health and well-being of a community is very much dependent on that community's ability to form connections within the community and outside, and to make these connections longer lasting. And a lot of this has to do with our approach to public health, our approach to community health. And then the final thing that I believe is very important is just that governments need to take input from residents to build better cities, which is just that the current model for public policy and how it's working does not focus on governments. And I'll get to this more as we talk about the question. And just one more thing, which I've highlighted here, is just that small community-led initiative leads to change. And this has been my focus throughout my research, because time and again, whatever city or neighborhood in Canada that I researched about, I was able to see how small community change is actually what's helping building neighborhoods there. Just a small example would be the Vancouver Foundation in the Greater Vancouver area, which is giving out grants to community leaders and community members that are able to give them proposals for small community initiatives that they want to do. So this ranges from, let's say, community parks, community neighborhood food kitchens, and movie nights with their neighbors. And this community organization is then helping them, give them funds to then make sure that their little initiatives are leading to change within their communities. Over the course of my research, some of the interesting opinions I got from people or suggestions I got from our community members, I have put here. A lot of them had to do with inclusivity, and one of them was definitely about building more inclusive community parks, which is just that people of all ages are able to enjoy themselves when they make the effort to go to a park, and also that there is intergenerational bonding happening between older citizens, between the youth, between children. And I believe that's a very, very good aspect of asset-based community development that we can further. Second was about food security, which I believe is personally very important. And in that sense, a lot of our community members suggested neighborhood gardens and breakfast kitchens as just a small community suggestion to what they can do in terms of food security. And then there was also, which I will talk about later as well, the use of social media to garner youth interest in asset-based community development. And I believe this is exceptionally important because this is where the future of asset-based community development is going. While the people who started it and the people who are leading it right now are doing a fantastic job, and a lot of them are at the Tamarack Institute, I do believe that the next generation of leaders needs to be brought in early on into the process to make sure that this model of community development goes further. So that was just a little bit about my research, a brief outline of what my research was. And I believe Justin has a couple of questions for me now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mohammed. Thank you for the presentation. As Mohammed just mentioned, I'm going to ask a few questions, both to sort of dig into it and sort of and where the interest came. So the first one, which is on the slide, is just coming from as a student of public policy, what sort of interested you in the use of asset-based community development as a lens for community change, and really thinking about how to advance public policy to support communities to have an impact. So what drew you to this research in the first place?
Absolutely. So over the summer, when I was looking to do something meaningful this summer, right before the summer, when I was looking for something this summer, I noticed a lot of organizations talking about community development. But as a student of public policy, I had not really heard of the term community development in any of my coursework or any of my textbooks. And I've taken a lot of public policy classes, but this never ever came up, right? We had set metrics of what public policy is. We had how can policy be made better? But none of that talked about any kind of engagement from communities, any kind of people's input. And for me, that was pretty strange because the title of the course is public policy, but the public aspect in public policy is very much lacking as how we practice it right now. And in that sense, when I talked to the partners at Samuel Center, they told me about the Tamarack Institute, and then I learned more about asset-based community development through their website and their online resources. And I was very interested because what this model meant was that the main chunk of where and how this model is created is through public input, is through the input of community partners, community leaders, organizations, rather than making policies and telling people this is what you need. Instead, you are asking people, what would you like to see, right? And for me, that really caught my attention. And I believe that that is the kind of model that going forward, we need to adapt for public policy as well. Because right now, people's only input to public policy is voting for their members, respected members of parliament. But after that, I feel like unless you are a community organizer or a community leader, your input into what kind of policy is acted upon you is very, very limited. And I believe that that is something that needs to change. And asset-based community development creates leaders. And I've seen that throughout the course of this research, that it fosters leadership within community members, makes the base of a neighborhood or a community larger and wider, which gives them more leeway to go around to their local governments or their municipalities to, get change to happen.
Thank you. my next question is, did you see it, like, while you were doing this research, you mentioned highlight some of the gaps, but some gaps in the current conversation, and research that you think still needs to be conducted to support advancing public policy for making community essential, and different research that can be done into different organs of government, allowing communities to come together so that they can have an impact. So just any research that you think is sort of next steps.
Right, absolutely. So in terms of the gaps within the current conversation, as I mentioned before, and I'm happy to elaborate now, there is a lack of newcomer perspective, immigrant perspective, and I would say a student and youth perspective as well into what people want to see from asset-based community development. A lot of community leaders that I interviewed on various various college campuses across Canada, they did not know about asset-based community development. And I believe that it's very important that people on university campuses know about asset-based community development, know that this is a model that they can follow to build community. And I believe that this is particularly important in larger cities such as Metro Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, because here we have what we call vertical neighborhoods, wherein we have large condo buildings, and that is technically your neighborhood and your community. And I did not find a lot of research based on how people are impacted living in vertical neighborhoods as opposed to living in, let's say, suburban neighborhoods, so I feel like that is definitely something that we need to focus on, because while a lot of the research caters to smaller neighborhoods across Canada, especially suburban neighborhoods, not a lot of it caters to vertical neighborhoods. And the only example, and I actually like to talk about this, that I found of a vertical neighborhood using a similar model, I wouldn't call it exactly asset-based community development, was the Regent Park community development plan, where they still had some kind of input from their community members, from the people who were already living there. They had online resources for how community members could access a communication with each other. So we definitely need to do a better job of figuring out how we can make vertical communities into thriving communities that care about social connection and social connectedness. And one way that I found that it can happen is definitely through social media and through the use of online resources. I actually know of a building right down the street from me in Toronto that is using a community board to make sure that the new residents that enter their building are able to connect with each other. And they host movie nights and they host community gardens every week where people are able to interact with each other. And I feel like these are the kind of models of research we should be focusing on. Apart from that, we do need to focus on how we can get more inclusion from the youth, because these are people that have a lot of following. These are people that have a lot of sway in the conversations that are happening nowadays, from music to movies. A lot of it now happens on online platforms such as TikTok and Instagram. Like, opinions are formed there. And I believe if we could permeate those boundaries and get into those spaces, that we would be able to have a much larger base and reach out there. So I think youth participation is definitely an area that we can look into. And I'm sure, Justin, you probably have some opinions about this as well.
I do, but I'm going to wait. So I think that's good. And I think that because you've mentioned it but didn't get too much into it, I think that brings us really nicely into the third question, which is, just in your report, and as you mentioned in your presentation, you highlight the sense of belonging might be the hardest to codify for policy and development. Mm-hmm. And we know that social isolation across the population, but especially for youth and newcomers, is really sort of an area that's been, we were in a difficult spot before the pandemic, but we know it's gotten significantly worse. Yeah. And I think one of the key things that we know, especially for youth, is that the use of these things, I don't know if it'll show up, but of phones and social media is actually making it not better, but worse. And so thinking through all those things, do you have any advice for how policymakers can support communities to dive into the work of belonging and work that can happen there?
Absolutely. So speaking specifically about the sense of belonging, which was a lens of an area of impact that I looked at my research through, I found this to be very difficult to quantify into terms that people can understand or people can relate to. So while sense of belonging can just be described as or defined as, I feel like I belong in this place, or I feel like this is where I should be. It's very difficult to actually make someone feel a sense of belonging to a place. And this is because there are a lot of factors that go into truly feeling like you belong in a space. And these factors range from feeling like you are safe, feeling like you are respected, feeling like your identity, your sexual identity, your gender identity, your religious and ethnic identity are not an issue with the larger community that you're present in, or that your identities are respected and celebrated. And that for me is a sense of belonging. And the reason that a lot of people suffer with this is because they believe that their identity is not relevant or is not important or is not respected in a space that they are present in. And while the government does a lot in terms of immigration, especially in Canada, like I feel like giving people landing papers is not the final step to making sure that they feel a sense of belonging to the country that they're coming into. You definitely need to then provide resources and work toward making sure that these people are able to find community within themselves or within the larger Canadian context. Because unless that happens, the sense of belonging is definitely going to be a weak point. And even for people who are already in Canada, I do believe that a sense of belonging is something that people are not able to form even after weeks, months, or years of living in a place, because they are not able to interact with their larger community. They don't see any kind of connectedness with even the people that live next to them. For example, my neighbors, I have never ever been able to connect with them, and that is because of a lot of factors. Like I've tried, but they're never home. And like I live in a vertical neighborhood, and I still don't know how I can reach out to them or what I can do to make sure that I know at least the 3 people that live around me. And in terms of this, like we do need community organizations to then think of it in these terms, wherein it is an issue, which is just that sense of belonging is weak, and what assets can be used to make sure that that sense of belonging is present for everyone. And in terms of the youth, I definitely believe that for them to be more interested in this work and for them to not be harmed by the plague of social isolation, they need to know that there are avenues out there for them. Like for me, I was very fortunate to find the concept of asset-based community development. I was very fortunate to work with the Tamarack Institute and with the Samuel Center. But a lot of people that I know, they don't know that these opportunities are out there. And I feel like if community organizations better partner with the college campuses and university campuses, they'll be firstly able to find very hardworking people who are looking for this kind of work, who are looking to be community members, to be community leaders. And the community organization presence on college campuses is also going to make sure that a lot of folks know that these resources exist. And if they want to know how to build a community or how to become a part of a community or become a community leader, like there are definitely people out there that can help them.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the only thing that I'll just make sure I put in here too is I think part of it is also a bit of a mental model shift too for public within the realm of public policy right now. We saw it with the response to the pandemic, but also in the response to issues of social isolation, loneliness, is that our policy making is still very much aimed at the individual. And so, which is important to deal with, the individual mental health crisis that is occurring, but often we see that in things like the development of a new like federal app to get people into it to see a counselor and that kind of thing, which is again important aspect of it, but it ultimately comes down to treating that situation for the individual rather than reflecting on the role that community can play within increasing belonging to then address social isolation. So yeah, I think that's one area where we need to shift the way that people think about the role of public policy to be more focused on the community aspect of it, to help deal with those pieces, right?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And the concept of like policy being focused on the individual is definitely one of the larger problems that I've had with like the kind of public policy that I've studied as well. Because that means that like we focus on providing resources to individuals and not providing resources to communities. And that in itself is not conducive to fostering community development.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to make sure that I'm looking at the time and seeing that there's 6 questions, which is exciting. So your report highlights the need for community-based organizations and strategies to welcome in and advance the voice of new Canadians, both for their plan development and public policy efforts broadly, so that they hear from different groups to make their community broader and deeper. So do you have recommendations for how community collaboratives can do this better, and how they can think about their goals in a way that is broader to those voices?
Definitely. So a large chunk of my research about asset-based community development was focused on newcomers to Canada, immigrants, international students, etc. So my first thing is just to recognize the assets that newcomers to Canada bring with them, which is obviously the first step, I believe, in the process of ABCD, is to recognize people's assets. And I feel like these are assets that we are letting go of, or we are not celebrating or not making use of. For example, the abundance of languages present in the newcomer context. There are people that would be very willing, and after talking to community members, I can say this with a lot of surety, that there are people very willing to teach folks new languages. There are people very willing to teach folks about their different foods and their different cultures. And this is something that we have to hone into the process. There are people out there who know a lot about asset-based community development. They simply don't know it in the English language. And for me, I believe that is an absolute waste of great information and resources that we could have taken into this context. So the first thing that I would suggest is definitely there is a great need to translate a lot of the information that we have on asset-based community development. While a lot of it is present in English and French, a lot of newcomers to Canada do not have English or French as their first language, or even a language that they are comfortable speaking in. And for that reason, I believe if we are to translate asset-based community development documents and findings and calls to action in different languages, for example, Hindi, Urdu, Chinese, Mandarin, that will definitely have an impact on how people view this process. Because I feel like the first step into inclusivity is making sure that you talk to people in a language that they are comfortable with, that they want to talk to you in. And apart from that, I feel like democratizing the knowledge that we currently have on asset-based community development is another great step to making sure that people are able to understand what we are talking about, and to make sure that we are not gatekeeping this information for just a few that are able to understand this. With that happening, I do feel like we will have a greater outreach into immigrant and newcomer communities. And as a result, we will see a larger base of assets. And that, I feel like, is very much the gist of asset-based community development. And to do this, I do feel like, again, I would reiterate that university campuses are a great place to start. You see a lot of newcomers to Canada in university campuses. These are people who have been in Canada for over 3-4 years, plan on staying longer, plan on working, plan on giving back to the Canadian economy, to their Canadian communities. And these are people that want to do something to firstly feel a sense of community and also give back to the country that has given a lot to them. So that would be a great place to start for a lot of community organizations, is to reach out to people and to hear what they have to say about asset-based community development, and also to then learn from their best practices that they have been doing for a very long time, just not under the ambit or the banner of asset-based community development.
So thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to ask you one more question and then turn it to the questions from the audience. Reminder that if you want to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. Yeah, from your research, talked about some of the gaps and some of the difficulties, but where do you see the greatest opportunities right now for moving forward, especially within the policy realm, where you think different orders of government are sort of ready to talk about different areas, and is it different between the municipal government, provincial / territorial, and the federal government?
Right. So this one is interesting. And throughout my research, I was able to identify what different levels of government are doing in terms of asset-based community development, or just community development in general. And I believe the most impact we can have right now is definitely on a municipal or local level, because they control more to do with neighborhoods and more to do with directly people going up to them and saying, this is what we need in our neighborhood or what we need in our community. The provincial and federal governments obviously have a greater and more important role, which is to look at public health, which is to look at immigration policies and how they can make immigration better and a better experience for people that are coming in. But I feel like that conversation is more difficult to have, and that conversation is more rooted in legislature as opposed to community members rising together to create impact. And if I'm not mistaken, and of course Justin, you can definitely correct me here, I do believe that certain municipalities and local governments are looking towards the asset-based community development model. Right. So I feel like that is absolutely where we can see the most amount of impact, because if you are able to get your neighborhood together and reach out to your municipal government, a lot of community members said that that is where they saw change happen.
Awesome, thank you. Given that we're now at 1:41, I think I've fit in that for Connor. If you want to kind of jump in and help us with the Q&A.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Justin. And also thanks to those who have asked questions in the Q&A panel. Just a final reminder, if you do have any questions, please feel free to share them within the chat box or within the Q&A panel. We should be able to get all of the questions. So I first want to start off with a question from Greg. And Greg asks, Greg's second question, sorry. Greg asks, you talk a lot about urban or suburban communities. What about the rural reality? How can the challenges they face, big territory, limited accessibility to services, lower education levels, etc., be overcome to make the most of the ABCD lens?
Definitely. So while I feel like a lot of the work that's been done in terms of ABCD has been done in a suburban context, I do feel like the two ends of the spectrum, which are rural communities and ultra urban communities, are something that we need to focus on more. There is definitely a gap in research surrounding how we can reach out to rural communities and help them cultivate an asset-based community model within their communities. And I'm sure Justin has more to say about this in terms of like the resources that are present at Tamarack or at other community development initiatives.
Yeah, sorry, one sec. I'm doing a bad job of pulling up resource, so I'll make sure that it gets shared within the the follow-up email. But the short answer is that there's lots and lots of assets that are still available within those rural communities, and I think it's about changing the view of what a neighborhood is and what those connections are. I spend a lot of time hearing about local community development through an asset-based community development lens in a somewhat rural neighborhood, because the team lead for Deepening Community, Heather, lives in a more rural community. But just to say that I think it's a matter of changing the scope of how we think about neighborhoods and thinking about it, and recognizing that it's not the same thing as the vertical neighborhoods that Mahammad mentioned, but saying that connection there. And there are resources that have been created around rural development within rural communities for ABCD, and I have them, but I will make sure that they get into the follow-up email for that question.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for your question, Greg. I now want to move on to a question from Susan. And Susan asks, what do you see is the role of municipal government in supporting ABCD in their most vulnerable communities? What are some ways to make municipal governments open to the systemic change that can support a grassroots level ABCD approach?
Sorry, could you just repeat that question, Connor?
Yeah, of course. Susan asks, what do you see as the role of the municipal government in supporting ABCD in their most vulnerable communities? What are some of the ways to make municipal governments open to the systemic change that can support a grassroots level ABCD approach?
Absolutely. So, thank you. That's a great question. And this is definitely a question that I have answered in my report as well. The first step is just to identify as what you mean by the most vulnerable community in the context of where you live in, right? So if that is a racialized minority, or if that is a newcomer or an immigrant, you just need to identify that first. Secondly, I feel like outreach is the most important aspect of asset-based community development. So reaching out to vulnerable members of your community. But in terms of municipal governments taking this more seriously, asset-based community development, the process is built on forming community leaders and making sure that those community leaders are then able to galvanize support from their community members, and then reaching out to your local municipalities and your local governments with what you would like to see as change. And following that model, I feel like the more leaders and the more community members that are interested in this process, the more leeway you have to reach out to a municipal government or a local government to get the change that you deserve and need in your community.
I think the only thing that I would add from the policy realm too is as municipalities are engaging in this work, and especially as they're thinking about how are they developing neighborhood strategies, how are they supporting their neighborhoods, especially for vulnerable pieces, there's sort of two parts that come up. One is around being brave enough to relinquish some power when it comes to decision making around how a neighborhood should be developing and building itself, rather than coming from the outside. Using the assets that currently exist within a neighborhood to be the ones who drive forward what those are. At Tamarack, we use a lot of collective impact, and part of that is about creating collaboratives where at times the government isn't the primary driver. A lot of times they're the one with funding capabilities, but not necessarily the one who makes the final decisions on things. And I think that's really important, but it does require a certain level of bravery from both elected officials and civil servants. And then the other piece too is creating resources to empower individuals with the skill sets that they need to take the lead within their asset-based community development work. I think those are ways that governments and especially municipalities can both shift power in a way that's really important, but also to create the structures through resource distribution to allow that to allow community development to happen through a lens of asset-based community development.
Absolutely.
I think that that question and your answer, Justin, kind of segues into our next question from an anonymous attendee. And this attendee is wondering, are there tools or resources that you recommend, tools that are existing already for having conversation with government partners to include communities in policy making, grant making, in areas that they haven't done before?
Yeah. Mahammad, if you want, I have a couple that I can go. But
you can take the lead. I think you can take the lead on this one.
Perfect, thanks. I think one, a lot of right now the work around this is more aimed at communities to sort of teach and provide resources into how they can think through policy change and move it forward. There's been a growth for sort of like the engage pieces of new ways to engage the community to give feedback on stuff. But there's been less around how governments can make the shift to be more community focused in how they make their decisions. Instead, it's about developing how communities can develop political capital. So there's that sort of piece that's there. One of the really interesting things for institutions, both government and foundations, groups like Tamarack, et cetera, that has created around that piece around funding, that I'm really excited that Tamarack's been a part of in the region of Peel, is things like participatory grant making. And that's around bringing in individuals with lived and living experiences of the work that's happening to form the leadership of how funding is done. So Tamarack has worked with the World Education Services Miriam Mustafa Fund to create a pilot project in Peel for newcomers to come together, determine what are the priorities within their community to advance work, and then also be the ones who make the decision about how funding occurs and how that's spread out. And I think that's something that municipalities, some have taken on, but could learn more about when they're doing community grants and when they're moving forward pieces, giving that power to the community and especially those people most impacted by whatever the grant will be, to be the ones who decide how resources are shared, and because they're going to be the ones who know both the challenges, but more importantly, the assets within their community to reinforce it. So I think that's a really powerful way that communities and specifically municipalities and institutions can be shifting power that way, and how they give and how they mobilize resources. If there's anything you want to add, Mohammed?
I think I agree with that.
Okay, cool.
Okay, awesome.
Very thorough with your answer.
All right, thank you to both. Staying on the topic of institutions, this is another question from Greg. Thanks for both your questions, Greg. Greg asks, what barriers exist to governments, thinking of municipal, provincial, and federal, or what barriers exist to government uptake and the use of ABCD? And do you guys have any ideas on how these barriers could be overcome?
Absolutely. I can go and then Justin can join in on answering this. So the first barrier that I think is obviously how to get people's opinions and people's mandate to themselves. I feel like getting so many people to reach out to the government or to access that amount of community and people is definitely a challenge that I was able to talk to a lot of government officials as well at the CAMH, at the Ministry of Health. They just said that the best they can do is create smaller focus groups in different communities. So an example is cognitive behavioral therapy that the Ministry of Health and CAMH was trying to focus towards people of South Asian heritage and descent. And for them, they did not have a lot of people that were willing to reach out and be a part of the project. And this is because of a lot of factors, such as the fact that mental health is definitely a larger taboo in newcomer and South Asian communities as of now. And I feel like for governments, reaching out to people is difficult because there are certain cultural differences or norms within communities, or even the fact that there is a lot of apathy present within certain communities to reach out to the government or help them in any capacity. And the way that they can overcome this is definitely by coming out with better programs that are catered more towards the grievances of a community or what the community wants from them. And I've seen successful examples of this in my research where the government or municipal organizations were able to reach out to people and take in information from them and then create policies based on that. Justin, if you would like to add.
I think one of there's a barrier, like a coexisting barrier between both how individuals see their interactions with government that requires a certain level of change, which I think is a part of the movement for deepening community, and also how governments see their role, right? I sort of mentioned it with the individualized piece of mental health supports and things like that, but and this is a big part of ABCD's lens, is there's a view that institutions and governments do for people, right? And so what often happens in these conversations is that the conversation is how can we better learn from groups to then do for, rather than how can we shift power and resources so that the community is doing for, right? And so that individuals are able to use their assets to do for. And I mentioned it in the previous answer, but I think that requires a lot of bravery from elected officials and civil servants to see that they can be creating the conditions for success within a community, but then allowing that community to succeed. And obviously within specific resources, sometimes that's harder to do in like individualized needs around mental health are a different piece there, but around creating the conditions for our community to succeed within those pieces, I think that is the big piece for us to overcome, is how do we create conditions for the community to do for. And I think we've seen some of that at the local level and at the municipal level, but I think it's harder for federal and provincial governments to see that. The only caveat I'll add is that there was work on this within the federal government in the early 2000s, but it has been slowed. So yeah, hope that answers your question. And I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to make sure that I give Connor the chance to wrap up soon. So
thanks, Justin. I think we have enough time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
So I think, Mohammed, this question is for you, and it's from Michael. The question asks, in terms of increasing the sense of belonging for recent immigrants, have you seen any programs, et cetera, that include mentorship to newcomers to help with the integration?
Absolutely. So that was thank you. That's a very good question. That was something that I was trying to find and look for, because I do believe that mentorship is a very important aspect of moving to a new place. Because if you have someone that is able to provide you with the resources on how you can self-actualize and succeed in a new space, that really does make a difference. Unfortunately, though, I was not able to find these resources. I, as a newcomer to Canada as well, I was not able to find these resources when I first moved here. I did find mentorship from people when I reached out to them. I found mentorship again on my university campus, in a lot of places that I worked in that had programs for newcomers. But I do believe that the burden of this is not on community organizations and even just firms that hire people or universities. The burden of this is definitely on the governments that are bringing people in. So they should definitely have tailored resources such as mentorship for newcomers.
Awesome, thank you. And I think this is going to be a great question to wrap up. And this question's from Francis. And Francis is just wondering how you create policy that centers around development and not just engagement. Francis elaborates, there's a difference, and they feel like development hasn't fully been embraced in Canada yet. So I was just wondering if either of you could speak to that question.
Sure, I do have some thoughts, and then I'm sure Justin can join in as well. I feel like the concept of development is something that we need to focus on in more detail. It's what we define development to be. In the context of my paper, I've talked about social development. So it's not as much economic development as people would like for it to be. But I believe social development is definitely the need of the hour. So while community engagement is definitely happening, I do feel that there is a lack in social development as such, and specifically in rural communities and rural neighborhoods, we do see this lack in social development. And I'm sure Justin can add something to this as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think on that piece, Chris, I fully agree about a lot of the times right now we see the question of how can community be more engaged as they make a decision. And even the concept of engagement is an interesting one, because are you engaged if you've been asked a question versus if you've had a chance to provide some sort of leadership over what the decision ends up being, are I think worthwhile questions. But I think part of that is around government setting, broad frameworks for what success could look like. A national strategy on belonging is a dream of mine that sort of sets the target that we're going to do something around that concept of belonging, of social inclusion, of ending the concept of isolation for Canadians as a target, and then create programs that turn towards how can we empower communities to do that work. And I think the reason why I talk about a national strategy is I think those national strategies, we've seen it within poverty reduction, help to lead to that growth at the provincial level, that then trickles down to support for the municipalities. I think municipalities is the ones closest to community and to individuals, have the ability to be more empowering in how they develop their neighborhood strategies, to take that step back that I mentioned, and turn to individual citizens and institutions to be the leaders of what they want their neighborhood to look like, and to allow them to build the social capital that they require for success. But those who have the greatest levers as it relates to purse strings and taxation are the provincial and federal government. So it's how can those levels of government engage and support what's happening at the local level more. That is my trying to be as quick as possible because I'm looking at the time. But I think that is the big question for how we do that. And I think a national strategy on belonging, on community, is the way that we move that forward.
Awesome. Thank you to you both for that question period, and also thanks to all the registrants who submitted their questions. I just want to quickly pivot to now just our announcements. We have a couple of upcoming events that I think are going to be really relevant to this conversation today. The first is an upcoming webinar on evaluating the impact of citizens sharing their gift, lessons learned from Abundant Communities Edmonton. So, this is very relevant to the conversation on ABCD and also looking at how institutions are actually implementing this at the municipal level. You just briefly in this webinar, Consulting Director of Evaluating Impact, Jean-Marie Chapeau, will sit down with the Abundant Community Edmonton's Howard Lawrence for a conversation on their 2020 impact report, the lessons learned from evaluating the impacts of citizens sharing their gifts, and also how to make evaluations simple and accessible for everyone. And then finally, I think another learning opportunity that was very relevant is our upcoming workshop, ABCD 101, Building Your Community Table. This is a really exciting virtual workshop opportunity that we've just launched. And then just briefly, together as learners will hear stories of municipalities and organizations centering community within their work. We will explore challenges, the lessons learned, and best practices to authentically engage the community. We truly believe that if you are in the field of community development and find yourself struggling to engage with residents, that this workshop is for you. So we will make sure that we include more of this, more about these events in the follow-up email, and I'll also quickly add both of these to the chat now. But on that note, I would just like to thank Justin and Mahammad for joining us today for a really exciting conversation about policy. I know policy and excitement usually don't get used in the same sentence, but I actually really enjoyed this conversation. And I would also just like to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon or this morning or wherever you are joining us from. We really appreciate you joining us. So Justin, Mahammad, any final words before we wrap up?
Oh, no, go ahead.
No, you first.
Okay, I just want to thank the Tamarack Institute for all their help in this process, and even the Samuel Center for all the resources, for all the mentorship and guidance. And I'd like to thank all the community members that gave me their interviews, that were very willing to share their opinions on these things, because that is where a chunk of my understanding of asset-based community development has come from. So yeah, just want to thank Justin and Heather and Connor for all their help as well. And thank you all for coming. I'm really glad that you came, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
I was going to thank the Samuel Center for being a wonderful partner, and Mahammad for being a part of this work over the summer. So thank you.
All right, have a great rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.